will have, great, you probably have to accept the recording. So if you would do that, please, then we'll have the recording. We'll make that available to you too through EARCOS, as well as the slides and the recording from last week. But let me start my screen share. And there we go. So when you get the slides, you'll know a little bit about us and our firm if you don't already, and you'll have our contact info. So please feel free to drop an email to either Abby or me, and we're happy to answer questions by email, or you're welcome to ask them here, pose them in the chat window, and we'll be trying to keep an eye on that chat window and see what's going by there, so we can make sure we catch anything that's that you're asking questions tonight. Okay.
So my chance to say hello. It's lovely to be here with you. My apologies for not being able to be with you last week. I tried and that just could not be helped, but delighted to be here with you tonight. Delighted to see so many people here with us. That's great. One final request, if you could please mute yourself, that would be great. It just kind of cuts back on any kind of background noise that we have, and it just makes it a little bit easier. So as Mark said, I'm Abby D'Alessio. I'm coming to you tonight from New York City. My husband and I split our time between New York and, I'm sorry, if you could just mute, thank you. New York and Tucson, Arizona, and I'm here in New York right now. So to get us started, if you could, thank you, in the chat window, tell us your name and school, and please give us some ideas of some of the things that you're working with. Some of the emergent issues, I'm guessing a lot of them are maybe COVID related or getting back into school, but share with us an emergent issue with which your school is dealing right now. So you can go ahead and put that into the chat, and Mark and I will try to keep an eye on that and weave that into our presentation tonight. If you could, Mark, next slide, please.
What, you mean I'm actually driving the slides on my computer?
Okay. So
I thought I was just watching this.
What are we going to talk about today? This is, today's, if last week was kind of maybe governance 101, this is governance 201, right? This is really how you take the skills that you and Mark spoke about last week and really, build capacity and build capability and truly add value to your school. So we're going to talk about understanding and adapting to demographic change, right? The evolution of the international school world continues to be fast and furious, and that has an impact on leadership and how leadership is approached. We're going to talk about, really how you do add that value, maximizing your success by simply avoiding the pitfalls of board service, because they're there. And if you're aware of them, you can avoid them and again, bring the value that boards need to bring. We can't get away without talking about COVID, right? It's still with us. It hasn't gone away. So what does that mean now that we're into year 2, right? How do we continue to adapt to this ongoing issue? And following on to that, what does it mean to be successful in a new era? So how do we look at success? What are the different ways that schools measure success now that are relevant and salient for what's going on now? So that's going to be pretty much what we're going to talk about. We may talk a little bit about leadership through partnership. We're going to do some case studies. So you got to put your thinking caps on and give us some feedback on that. But let's go ahead and
Abby, I'm looking at the messages coming in from folks, and I'm seeing much of the stuff we're going to talk about around.
Right. Remember turnover, right?
Enrollment,
partnership.
Partnerships, long-term picture for strategy for the school, transitions back to on-campus learning and the very fluid world. Yeah, this is so interesting because we are beginning at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the 3rd school year disrupted by COVID.
Yes.
And that's really remarkable, because even though our elapsed time since the first cases is much less than that, it really spans 3 years of student experiences. And we now have board members in schools that have been, their entire board service has happened without attending an in-person meeting. Yeah. So a lot of remarkable moments here, and I'm seeing many of these go by in your chat. Yeah, Darren, maintaining momentum after 18 months, it gets to
Right.
be wearying, doesn't it? Well, we'll get into that. So cool.
Yep. Okay, so that's a beautiful segue into kind of where are we, right, in fall 2021. And I think that you all saw this slide last week, but Mark and I felt that it was worthwhile sharing it again. So what's going on out there? So navigating the COVID long tail, which is a longer tail, I think, than any of us thought it was going to be. None of us have crystal balls, but I would pretty much, I would feel safe saying that no one would have said, okay, 20 months into this, we're kind of still dealing with the same thing and we're dealing with new waves. And as Mark just pointed out, we're dealing with the third consecutive school year that's been impacted by this. So that's, clearly, a forefront for everybody. Global geopolitics, right? So that, there continues to be factions and fractures in the world and impacting demographic flows and impacting relationships between countries and within countries. And that impacts, obviously, who's coming to your school and who's not coming to your school, and how things are going to be functioning. Climate change, huge issue, climate change. And it's not just the disasters, okay? So as Mark referenced, Ed is dealing with a power outage, perhaps due to Ida. In New York, we got walloped on Wednesday due to Ida. So the disasters are front and forward, but really this has a longer term impact, right? The climate change is really going to, and in one of those slides we're going to see later, we're going to be talking a little bit about the future of work and some predictions that McKinsey has. And so there's impacts to this beyond the immediate disaster. There are impacts to the future of work. There are impacts to economic impacts, what students are going to be learning, what they're going to need to learn, the types of jobs they're going to get are all impacted by climate change. Changing demography in international schools. This has been ongoing for a while and it just continues. So how are we going to deal with that? Well-being. Increasing concern about well-being. That was a huge topic for us last year, and it continues to be a huge topic, but it's not just about the students. Of course, we talk about social and emotional learning and health and well-being and working that into your programming, but that is equally important to all of the stakeholder groups, for the administration, for the faculty, for the parents. This is a global issue for schools. It's not just about the students. And then just kind of anxiety, just this maybe unnamed, and you can't put your finger on it, but anxiety and anger that derive from all of the issues that we just spoke about, that I just spoke about. But also, I think there's just a continuing feeling that we don't have control over everything that we'd like to have control over, and that leads to anxiety and anger. So these are the things that you are all dealing with, that your boards are dealing with, that your communities are dealing with, right? So need to be aware of all of those.
It's an interesting year for the backdrop, and we're going to talk about a number of these things, particularly demographic change. We're going to touch a little bit on some of the follow-on effects of climate change on our students' futures. We'll periodically reference this massive ambient anxiety and anger. Abby's notion about the lack of control, though, is really key there. Psychologically, and forgive me for falling back on my professional roots for a moment, I think we pretend in most times that we have more control than we really do. Mm. And then it takes events like all of these to remind us how little control we actually have.
Yeah.
And when we're confronted with that right in our face, that's a psychologically very difficult moment.
Yeah. And it's not just one thing, Mark. It's right. It's the perfect storm of things, right? It's multiple issues.
So also last week we spoke about trends in governance that we're seeing. We'll just briefly mention these for folks who might not have been in the meeting last week, but the importance for schools as demographic change happens in rediscovering their purpose, either reaffirming their old purpose, if that's still applicable, or finding a new one. Because, and this could be a whole webinar in itself about the changing, and we're going to get a little into this, but not much tonight. The changing nature of international schools and the demographically driven nature of that. Becoming intentional and strategic about board recruitment. We still run into too many schools that are either haphazard in their approach to board member recruitment, or simply take whoever's willing to sit in the seat. And as the challenges facing schools grow, the importance of having the right people at the board table becomes much, much higher. So even though times are tough and the supply of potential candidates may not be deep, becoming more intentional and strategic about recruitment is never been more important. Figuring out what oversight looks like in an environment where, well, you might not be in the school very often, which is interesting. I'm a trustee at a large pre-K-12 school in K-12 school in Los Angeles, and we're coming up to our first board meeting of the year next year. We'll do it in person, but really we can only be in the building for very narrow windows of time when students aren't physically present. And what oversight looks like and our reliance on information from management and becomes much more important in these moments, which also speaks to our risk appetite. I think one follow-on effect a decade from now will be reassessing the risks we incur as a school from pandemics, from natural disasters, from all manner of things that are part of the present moment. And then redefining what the value proposition and what success looks like for our school. We're going to spend a lot of time with this one later because we think it's really important. And I know from private conversations with at least 3 of you in this meeting that you're struggling with coming to terms that how you used to define success for your school and for your career now is different. And it must be different because, well, stuff happens, you know, that's just the nature of it. The situation has changed around us. And as a result, it's time to reestablish priorities for our school. Abby?
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we go ahead, I want to, because I don't think you can overestimate this or overemphasize it, getting that oversight right. And I think in a situation like this with COVID, when you're not at the school and when you're not, perhaps getting the information in the way that you got it before, I think there's an instinct to try to dive in. And we're going to talk about this more later, right? There's an instinct to dive in and try to get more involved than perhaps is right. So I think that really has to be very carefully calibrated and really developing the understandings and the relationship between the board and the head of school. So, this is how the information flow is going to work now. And this is the oversight that the board is going to provide and very clear expectations about how that's going to happen, because I think that's an area that's really ripe for for some, could be somewhat problematic if people just kind of knee jerk into, okay, I'm not getting enough, I need to do more.
Before we move on, I have to say, if you haven't had a moment to scroll through the chat window, please do. If nothing else, if you have any sense that maybe you're alone and that your school is the only school dealing with something, the chat window will help a lot in that regard. It'll make you feel like others are at least struggling with some of the same things. So we're going to talk quite a bit about demographic change and really the implication of demographic change for schools, because we think it goes deeper perhaps than most people are thinking about, and it plays out in tensions within the school community that we'd like to unpack with you. And these are things to be cognizant of, because these tensions can play out in momentary interactions in the hallway or in the drop-off line that then have an effect in the boardroom. And being cognizant of the impact these tensions can have are important. Let's start with a slide that we often do, a little bit augmented this time around. And that's the picture of international schools. And ISC Research, a consultancy based in the EU, tracks based in the UK, actually, which is not technically the EU anymore, right? I have to amend what I'm saying. Tracks international schools and collects a great deal of data. People from ISC routinely present at EARCOS meetings. So in their data, comparing the growth in international schools, say between the year 2000 and 2020, that's just a 20-year horizon. What you see is a absolutely exponential growth in the number of schools, the number of students, the number of staff, and the amount of fee income associated with this. And that 54.8 US billion is not lost on investors. And that's why there's so many for-profit schools that have entered, particularly in the East and Southeast Asia regions, is because there's money there and people are coming in for that. However, if you look at that, oh, excuse me, sorry, the wrong thing. If you look at that trend line and then look at their 2021 statistics, you notice something really, really interesting. This is the COVID effect illustrated graphically. A slight increase in the number of schools, but a decrease in the number of students, a decrease in the number of staff, and a decrease in the amount of income flowing to schools in that year. That's remarkable because that's the first time in more than 20 years that the industry has either been flat or shrunk slightly in terms of the number of students it serves. That's remarkable. So this event that we're all dealing with really is the proverbial meteor strike landing in the middle of our pond. And it's having an effect that's measurable and demonstrable on independent schools everywhere. So if your school feels stressed as a result of it, you're not without company. And this really illustrates the impact on the industry that this is happening. Now, to be sure, this isn't a huge retrenchment, but a retrenchment from a phenomenal growth curve, even of this much, is going to be something that really we feel this. So if this feels like we've been going through something big, we've been going through something big. This illustrates it beautifully. So tracking a number of shifts that have come as a result of this. There's several. Abby is a recovering board chair from Hong Kong International School from many years standing. So she has firsthand experience with these. We work with dozens of schools in your region, and we see this happening at every single school that we're working with. And first shift is the shift from expats to locals, and particularly from Anglophone expats to everything else. So the time was when first English as first language students were the majority, even the overwhelming majority in many schools. Today, we're looking at much more premium on ESL and ways of onboarding students whose language proficiency may be much less. So it's not only expat to local, but it's more Anglophone to the rest of the world in terms of languages, which creates, well, it creates fault lines. We're going to use that as our analogy in a moment. And from west to east, as the expat flows change. If it's, they're still expats, but they look different and they come from different places. So our school communities today may be bigger than they were 30 years ago, but they certainly look different than they did 30 years ago. And the news we have for you is that curve is only going to continue. So this one's not going to start retrenching. This is a pre-COVID curve that, if anything, has accelerated during COVID. For some of you who are in oil and gas dependent areas, it accelerated during the decline in those sectors, but it's not going back. This one's a long-term one. It's continuing, which means that in our schools, in our communities, and Abby, I don't think we've ever been to a school where when we've done focus groups with with teachers and with parents. Every time we do it, people say that what's valuable about the school is the community. We keep hearing
Absolutely.
so much about community.
Absolutely.
Yet our communities are less homogenous, we say from monism to pluralism, less focused around a single identity, American, Canadian, British, and more focused around a pluralistic set of identities that are great spices that may not all blend together exactly well in the school community, which is that increasingly diverse population we have. And then finally, the post 2020 new normal. I'm not sure we know at all what the new normal is going to look like. But one thing we know is exactly what the McKinsey consulting group told us, is that the goalposts keep shifting with every new variant. And the Delta variant of the coronavirus shifted the goalposts everywhere in the world, and has meant, to use that sport analogy, that when we thought we were getting close, suddenly we find out we have a long way to go upfield. And that is frustrating. It can be demoralizing. And then it feeds into that anxiety and anger piece.
It induces that anxiety that we were speaking about, right? Because again, that sense of control that we thought we were almost there, right? We were almost there, having control of it. No, and it was snatched right away. And that challenges, right, that come with that.
So net result, we're dealing with plate tectonics in our schools. And I think since the beginning of this, we've had more calls from schools wanting help in navigating the differences between groups in the schools, preferences, interests, values, than ever before. So we think that if plate tectonics are a geological force in the world, then they're certainly a force in our school right now. And we want boards to realize how heads of school are managing shifting plates. And we all know that from our basic college classes in this, that where the plates come together is where the action happens, right? That's where things get kind of hairy. So heads live on that fault line, and navigating it over the next 9, 12, 24, 36 months is going to be as fraught as it has been over the past 36 months. Abby?
Oh, okay. So Mark mentioned this before, the tensions from demographic change. So where do we see those fault lines happening? Where do we see a conflict and perhaps tensions arising? Money is clearly one of them, and that manifests itself in a variety of ways. Okay, so when you're looking at a more heterogeneous population in schools, when you're looking at more local populations in schools, you're looking also at different ways of paying. So you've got self-paying parents and you've got corporate paying parents. Okay, and different expectations from that. Changing demographics are leading to changing packages in school, and how the disposable income that people have for tuition and for school. So that's going to impact who is coming to the school, right? The days of infinite elasticity for tuition and what people are paying, those days I think are long gone. So money is clearly an issue where when you have these very diverse communities, that's something that heads and boards are going to have to be thinking about, and how they deal with this in a pluralistic, multicultural setting.
Yeah, and Abby, I think a lot of the schools in the region that we're in touch with have either started or are interested in starting fundraising programs, advancement programs.
Absolutely.
And different demographic groups have different attitudes about philanthropy and about the appropriateness of donating money to school,
right,
when school almost universally in their home country is a birthright.
is a birthright, right? So, and that, we were talking about cultural and different norms. A couple of years ago, Mark and Judy and I did a program in Hong Kong, and it was focused on advancement. And it was such a learning experience, at least for me. I don't know about for Mark and Judy, in just the people, and these were people all within Asia, but so many different thoughts and perspectives on fundraising between people from Hong Kong and people from Korea and people from Japan. And that really is something that boards and heads have to think about, because identifying alternative revenue streams is something that every school is going to have to think about. So if you're not dealing with fundraising or you're not thinking about it, my guess is you probably will be sooner rather than later.
Education itself is one of those tensions as well. What do we think constitutes a good education? What do we think constitutes a desirable university destination for our students? All of these things are not just in flux, which we're certainly seeing around university placement as a result of the aforementioned challenges, but they sometimes break along fault lines of what's the ideal curriculum, what's the ideal pedagogy that should be a practice in the school. If we're I don't want to pick on particular cases, but if we're a brand associated with a national curriculum, does that still have currency in the market that we're in, given the demographic shifts that we're seeing?
Okay, morality and decorum. Okay, so Mark mentioned before that when we talk to schools, community is always cited as something that's very important. People don't want to see change. That really is a hallmark of almost every school that we speak with. But that community, as Mark said, is not a culturally homogenous community. It's not an ethnically homogenous community. So it's a community that you bring together. It's more of a you're driven by values and shared expectations. So when you have different cultures, we deal with schools that have kids in them from 40, 50, 60 different countries, and the values are different, and how people behave and what's acceptable behavior and what are the norms of a society are vastly different from one country to another. And those things all have to be balanced, right? And mesh together to bring a cohesive whole for a school community. So that gets challenging sometimes when you have Westerners and people from Eastern countries who have very different perspectives on what's the appropriate behavior in certain situations.
And navigating that, again, heads of school, teachers in classrooms sit right on the center of that fault line. Fault line, going with our tectonic plates, Abby. I grew up in a place where that was very seismically active. And a main street near our house had, you could actually see the crack in the center of the street get wider some years as seismic activity was more. And I think that's what we're seeing in schools, is there's more stress points there around these fault lines. And that means that while we're even navigating masking and vaccines and everything else with COVID, we're also dealing with these more entrenched dynamics in schools too.
Yeah.
Governance. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, don't you think, I think, Mark, also that COVID and masking and all of the, what's going on, going back to our fall 2021 slide, it's exacerbated these changes. I think these fault lines, it's just heightened them more. And I think made them, the situation more tense in many circumstances. So it's, it's kind of heightened it more.
And governance itself, and I say this as a little bit of something of a governance walk, and theories of governance and a variety of arcane subjects that I promise I won't go into right now. But attitudes toward governance differ by region of the globe. What constitutes good governance in North America may be very different than what constitutes good governance in East Asia, or what constitutes good governance in Europe. Different nationalities, different backgrounds will have differing attitudes toward the level of governance scrutiny that's appropriate or not appropriate. As one board chair in a country in your region said to me one evening after a board retreat, what you in America consider to be good governance, we in our country consider to be dereliction of duty. And that's a fault line that plays out as our schools become ever more pluralistic and heterogeneous.
Conflict, cultural, real significant cultural dimension differences. The way that conflict is dealt with in different countries is, the differences are stark. The way that some Western countries, that Americans, North America, would deal with conflict, and the way that some Eastern countries are vastly different. And again, going back to Mark's point, teachers, heads of school, administrators, you're sitting right there in the middle of this. You're right on this fault line, having to deal with conflict and having to understand and really read the other person that you're with, to try to really get to the crux of the matter and deal effectively with it. Because individuals deal with conflict differently. Cultures have vastly different ways of dealing with conflict, and heads of school and teachers have to balance that and make sure they're getting to the crux of the matter and resolving it. Right? The intent is to resolve.
Same thing with authority.
Mhm.
And what's our attitude towards authority and toward authoritative voices varies widely around the world. More pluralistic environments bring into conflict
Right.
attitudes about who's in charge and what does it mean to be in charge and what does it mean to be, forgive me, a customer or a stakeholder. Or if in a case of a school where there are association members who vote for board members, what the privileges that go with that nature of voting and the potential access to governance.
Right. And of course, leadership, right? And people's expectations of leadership. There are certain societies where leadership and power distance are they're more egalitarian, and some are more hierarchical. And how do you, if you're a person who's coming out of one type of culture and you're thrust into another, how do you manage that, right? With the expectations of, what your team and what your stakeholders are going to expect from leadership within a culture. Right. And boy, our heads of school and teachers really living on that fault line. So what does all this mean? Right. So where are we going to go from here? Okay. So the big trends that we think are going to continue or even speed up is we're going to continue to see increasing global mobility from non-Anglophone countries. As Mark said before, the days of the expat, the traditional Western UK or US expat, those days are long gone. So then, of course, we are seeing a decreasing traditional expat flow from the UK and from the USA, right? And we're seeing increased flows from other regions of the world. Mark, can you advance the slide? Thanks. Okay. Again, and given this, we're going to see an increasingly pluralistic student body in schools. Okay. I mentioned before that Mark and I deal with schools, and Judy deal with schools who have kids from 50 or 60 different countries. So that homogenous kind of, okay, you walk. Okay. I got muted. Sorry. I don't know where I got muted there. Mark, the next point. Okay, yeah, an increasingly pluralistic student body. Okay, so the days of walking onto a campus and seeing groups of people who look, much alike are gone. Very, very heterogeneous populations in schools. Okay. More nonprofits or for-profits. Okay. So I think a huge part of the growth, certainly in China, and I think in Southeast Asia, is coming for-profits. And not only there as well. I mean, we have clients in Europe and they're seeing that as well. So what does that mean? You're going to have to take that into account. So the international schools that we all know and have been in place for a very long time, that's not the model that's driving the growth. I don't think it's more for-profit or family-owned or corporately owned, real estate developers. So a different model of schools out there. So what does that mean for you? Go ahead.
Here's the drum roll. Here's the whole, if we could do an audio drum roll, we would do it here for
That's what you need. Okay. So what does that all mean for you guys, right? As leaders, you need to be culturally literate. You need to be savvy about the environment within which you're working. You need to spend time learning the culture and making sure that what you're doing is culturally congruent. Okay. You need that to happen. Right. So, Mark and I have often said that if you know one international school, you know one international school. And while there are basic pillars and best practices and things that Mark and I are going to be talking about, those things always have to be implemented in a way that's consistent and aligned with the culture. That's how you get buy-in, and that's how you develop your strength and your sustainability. So what does this mean for schools themselves, for the international schools? Okay. So it means that we need to be looking at schools as complex social systems in flux. Okay. That last part, in flux, is incredibly important, continually evolving, continually changing. Okay. So it's not a static institution. Schools are complex, living, breathing entities, and they have to be led as such. Okay.
Abby, if I could say something about that.
Go ahead.
For some of you may know, I'm in my 15th year as a board member in the same school, in the school in Los Angeles. And one of the things that's been really important to understand and to factor into how we think about the future of our school, for me as a longtime board member, is that our systems are in flux too. The school that we were, the board that we were, the community that we were is different now. We've moved, we've changed. In some ways, we've been successful, and we get some effects of that. But for people who may be for some of you who have been in school communities for a number of years, you need to be open to the possibility that the school you're governing may not be the school that you knew when you signed up as a parent or when you first got on the board.
So Andy, I love that comment. So Andy Leithwood has said, given all the differences in schools, I think the term wise practice is a term we could substitute for best practice. I think that's terrific. And I'm telling you right now, we're going to use that one. So we'll cite you appropriately as the author of that. Okay, so what else does it mean? Schools as pluralistic communities, right? We've said this several times now. Okay, it's diverse. There's a plurality of cultures, a plurality of nationalities. There's a plurality of interests and expectations, right? So you have, as many different, you have a variety of different stakeholder groups, but your parents are not a monolithic body, right? Your parents have different cultural expectations, different norms, and different interests. So schools really are coalitions of interests. And, wise heads and wise boards are aware of that and keep that in mind and use that and keep when they're driving towards achieving the mission and the vision, understanding that everybody's expectation is going to be slightly different. Okay.
And Abby, this is, forgive me, but this is something that's really important. You used a word that I think is underused in the international school space, but is absolutely so important. And that's the word coalition.
Coalition. Yeah. So put up the next point, put up the next bullet point. There you go.
Yeah. Coalition. Because if you think about coalitions, we know three things about them. And in terms of governance, one is that they're super attractive because they bring together multiple parties to make common cause. But we also know that they're inherently unstable. And if you think about those countries in the world that are governed by coalition governments, they're some of the ones that have the most fractures between interest groups, because a tremendous amount of effort has to go into holding the coalition together.
And they are constantly shifting. And that going back to our plate tectonic. I mean, that is a really, really great example of that, because the coalitions the coalition that you had today, something's going to happen. And, one part of that coalition is going to go, yeah, I'm not with you on that one. So we're dropping out. And then, the work has to begin again. Okay, how do we bring these groups together? How do we unite a school that's diverse and with different expectations under our banner, under our mission, and aligned with our values?
Yeah, I'm beginning to think that maybe the job of head of school is less being CEO than being the prime minister in a parliamentary system that has a coalition alliance to govern.
Yeah.
And a big part of your job is to hold the coalition together, not just to govern, the coalition of families together that's necessary to make up a school, right? So we could work this coalition idea endlessly, but coalition, the point I want people to take away is A, coalitions are inherently unstable, and B, they take a phenomenal amount of work to maintain.
Yeah. So our last point here is, Mark said prime minister, or mayors, right? But it's that kind of action. It's that kind of activity of, and it's an active, deliberate practice of understanding that, you are in increasingly heterogeneous and diverse population, and what kind of work do you have to put into it to keep it together? Right, to keep it united under the banner of the mission, the vision, and the core values of the school, because that's what builds the community, right? The community is so diverse and so pluralistic. It's not bound together by nationality or ethnicity. It's bound together by mission, vision, and values. And you have to continually work at that to keep the coalitions together.
Abby, if I could, I'm going to bring two comments in from the chat window that I think are worthy of mention. Right. Our friend David Toes,
yes, I was good.
Many of you know, is truly one of the legends in the region. Says, I think schools maybe become less pluralistic and more local in terms of population, as you would see in the international schools, in quotes, in Central and South America. Look at the change in the international schools in China. I think that's a trend line, David. I think that absolutely is.
It is.
That's where, absent some other meteor kind of strike event, that's where this is heading. If we look down the road. Yeah. Oh, it's your birthday. Oh, well, happy birthday, David. Someone just sent me that message saying it's your birthday. So we'll do that, and I promise you, we will not sing happy birthday. No,
that would run them all off the call if we.
That would be the end.
That would be the end of it. Well, okay, hold on, wait, Campbell.
Pardon, Nadine was where I was going, but is saying it's the conductor of an orchestra. Yeah, the two archetypes that I kind of like, conductor of an orchestra. I like this mayor of a city idea, because I think even the conductor of an orchestra has too much power compared to heads of school. Heads of school have to hold the neighborhood association together with the sanitation union, with the
Okay, so Campbell has said coalitions require leadership. They cannot be democracies, and oh boy, are you right. They require deliberate, intentional, well thought out, decisive leadership, right? We can't go out and say, okay, we're going to poll everybody now and see what's going on here. You want to engage, you want to involve your community, but coalitions require leadership.
Andy, I like the conductor analogy with the musicians all in different rooms. Well, that's certainly true in Zoom.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's true anyway, but really Zoom just magnifies that effect. Well, so I think you're all getting, we're going, these things didn't just start in COVID. They were there before, but if anything, actually, I can't think of anything that COVID has made better, but they've been intensified as a result of COVID. And they've been intensified as a result if you're in an area where climate change is wreaking havoc. So the trend lines here are more of these kinds of things, which means that we need to have some degree of empathy, I think, with each other in this business of leading and governing schools, about the complexity of the role and the difficulty of the role, given all the circumstances that we're dealing with. Frankly, as a bit of an outsider, looking in at the industry. I don't have a child in a school anymore. My son's 31. He's not on the school business anymore. But looking at schools as an observer, I'm just amazed at the job you all have done keeping school going for children, for families through this. And that's phenomenal in itself. And I know you live lives bathed in lots of criticism, but I do hope from time to time you can step back, look at it and say, we're dealing with big headwinds here. And we've actually dealt with them pretty well. And we've kept school going on really well
Yes.
for our families, which means we now need to talk about a couple things. We need to talk about how you govern by avoiding pitfalls. So,
Right.
the risks here are high. The schools can ill afford distractions at this moment because the distractions come at huge costs. There's just not a lot of bandwidth in our schools anymore for extra stuff. And
Yeah.
that I think we have to talk about is how we, as board members, so this is board members to board members, Abby and I to you all, how do we maximize success? Then we're going to look at the topic, we're somewhere in here, we're going to need to do a break, which I promise you we will do. And then we'll look at how do we really define success, given the moment that we're in.
Right. So Mark, you make a very good point, and maybe you may have shown it on last session, kind of the high wire, the high wire.
I did, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, governance is always important, and international school governance has always been a high wire balancing act. But I think the wire just got, over the last 18 months, 20 months, the wire has gotten a lot higher, right? And predictably, what we want to talk about now is how we can help you avoid some predictably difficult issues and you're keeping yourselves out of trouble. So
I think what we'll do is a couple of slides, Abby, and then before the case study that we have planned, we'll go out to break. Then we'll come right back to the break into the case study. So let's hit these two.
Okay, so what are some habits of effective board members? Okay, so again, this is not rocket science, but it's important. Going solo is a no-no. Okay, for board members out there, you are not a power of one. You are part of a group. The authority is a collective authority. Okay, so we I always say we don't want any rogue board members. We don't want people running off the organization. This is a team effort. It's a collaborative effort. It's a collaborative effort within the board and a collaborative effort between the board and the head of school. So going solo is not good. Okay, it's a no-no. All right.
That's a slogan, by the way, that should be on boardroom walls, is that going solo is a no-no.
Oh,
yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay. So given that going solo is a no-no, respect the team, right? Respect your fellow board members, respect the administration, respect the efforts and the time and the expertise they are bringing to this endeavor. Right. This is not, being on a board is not like going out to a summer barbecue, right? This is serious work with serious impacts that come to play. So respect the team, respect the work that everybody's doing. Please understand the difference between the board and the staff, and what the board does. And last week, I'm sure Mark talked about roles and responsibilities last week. So one of the things that I hear, and I'm sure Mark and Judy hear as well, when we work with schools, is there seems to be sometimes a lack of clarity about the roles and the responsibilities, the respective roles and the responsibilities between the board and the leadership team in the school. So please take the time to understand that and mind boundaries, right? Understand, come to consensus within the board and between the board and the leadership of the school of how you're going to do the business of the school, who's going to be making decisions in what decisions, and how you're going to work together. So understand that difference. Okay. Share and defend your views. Okay. The boardroom is not a vacuum where people just say yes or rubber stamp things. Okay. It's meant to be deliberative. It's meant to be a place for constructive, robust, fulsome dialogue. Okay. That has to happen. And there have to be, opposing points of view, because you need to look at scenarios and you need to look at alternatives. But share your views, defend your views, but listen, really listen and understand, seek to understand the views of others. Okay, it's an active listening. Do your homework, come prepared. Okay, when you're getting ready to go into a board meeting, make sure that you have done all of your reading, you've asked questions ahead of time, and the questions that you're asking are relevant to what you are doing as board members. And again, that's a strategic long-term focus. Okay, focus on where you add the value. Okay, you can do as a board, you can do all the right things. You can make sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed, and you've taken care of all of the fiduciary things, but you can still not add the value that you should be adding if you're not focused on the right things.
You know, that's an important point, Abby. I was thinking of this earlier today in preparation for this session, that if all you do is focus on the legal requirements of being a board member, you will have passed muster by the law in the country you're in and by minimum standards. But that's going to be an incredibly boring role. There's very little in the legal obligations that's there to be excited about. The excitement is in what you're talking about, doing your homework and asking strategic questions.
Yeah, I mean, and the excitement and the value, right? I mean, and I'm not, Mark and I are not, or I'm not suggesting that the legal elements and the fiduciary responsibilities don't add value. Of course, there's value there, but the long-term sustainability and the strategic direction for the school, that's the real value, right? That's what you guys bring to the table. Respect the duties of being a board member, right? You understand what your role is. You need to go to meetings. You need to be appropriately visible in the community. You need to do your committee work, right? That's where the work of the board gets done, really, right? In committees, right? So you need to respect those duties and fulfill them. And last but not least, keep learning. Okay, you're serving educational institutions. Keep learning. What you want to bring to the table is a culture of inquiry. You want to seek context. You want to seek understanding. That's what we expect of our students. The same thing should be expected of you as board members.
So there's a literature, we know, research has been done. AGB, Association of Governing Boards of Colleges and Universities, has looked at how smart boards get into trouble. Now, I added the smart, by the way. They just said how boards get into trouble. But boards of major educational institutions are made up of smart people. That's almost a prerequisite. We know that every single person in this meeting is above average in IQ. We didn't give you an IQ test. Maybe we did. You just didn't realize it as you were logging in. No, that's not true. But we know you wouldn't be in this position if you weren't above average in IQ. You're here. You've passed through multiple eyes of ever smaller needles to get to this particular role. So we know you're smart. So how do you get into trouble? 4 ways. And then that's going to tee up our case study. The first is dysfunctional group dynamics within the board. So, you can't all get along, can't play in a sandbox with each other. So rivalries, dominion of the few, bad communication, bad chemistry, impede deliberation and decision-making. I'm dealing with a total school meltdown right now that could be explained purely by bad communication between board leadership and board members. And the damage that's been done is just severe as a result of that. So dysfunctional group dynamics is a huge contributor to how boards get into trouble, as are disengaged board members. Now, wait, we got another one coming on this, but disengaged board, because some of the heads are thinking, wait a minute, some of my board members are so engaged they want to fire the basketball coach. We're getting there.
That's next.
Disengaged board members don't really, and by disengaged, I say you don't know the critical opportunities and challenges for the school, nor demonstrate much desire to find out. You assume. So if you're a new board member, and I saw several in the chat said they were new board members, a huge effort you have to mount this year, and I agree, it's bigger now because of COVID, because it's harder, is to understand what are the school's strategic challenges and opportunities related to where we are, what we're dealing with, what the dynamics have been, what our history is, because until you really understand those, you can't be an intelligent contributing board member. But then there's that other side, right? Board members that are too engaged. They assume a firefighting posture in response to every anecdote about the school. Schools are anecdote factories. They create them every day. And if you're a parent in the school, every evening you hear at the dinner table, sometimes literally, who hit whom today at school. And that conversation immerses you in anecdotes, not in data, that's a plural. Anecdotes are singular. And one of the ideas we're going to keep developing with you is that board members need to govern at the right altitude, not too high, not too low, and they need to govern by data, not anecdote. And finally, board members are often uncertain of their roles and responsibilities, of where board members stops and staff begin.
Right.
Of where being a part of what Abby spoke about, a collective board is one thing, yet being, say, chair of a committee, and what is your role as chair of the committee versus the full board instructing management.
So Mark, before we, I know we're going to go to break, but
Yes.
I just wanted to say one thing about the dysfunctional group dynamics.
Please.
Fit. You know, when people talk about when they're looking to hire a head of school or director, there, you know, fit is something that we talk about a lot. Is this person going to fit with our culture, with our values, with, you know, how we do things here at our school? That kind of assessment or analysis is just as important for board members. Yes, you want board members who have a, you know, you want your board to have a wide range of expertise and professional experience, you know, operational and or legal or financial, but fit is very, very important. I think if more time was spent up front, vetting, for lack of a better word, prospective board members and getting to know people through work on committees or task forces, so that you can see how people work together and people can see how your board does its business. I think if we spent more time with that up front, you could mitigate some of those dysfunctional group dynamics. Right. I often see, Mark, I know the school that you serve on the board, you spend a tremendous amount of time doing that with people.
An obsessive amount of time, yes. Right. And it's worth it every time.
Hugely worth it. And too often the attention is just not paid. And then you get somebody on the board and it's like more time is spent managing that individual than is doing the strategic and generative work of the board. And that detracts from.
But it's harder now, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's harder because we're doing it this way. We're doing it with Zoom, and you know, we can all dress up and smell nice on Zoom, but sometimes when we get together in person, it's less so. We're going to go to break now. I want to say something, please, before we go to break. We want you all to come back, because we're going to come right back and dive into a case study to work with this, and we really want you to be part of that. You've been amazing in the chat window. You've thrown out great stuff. Great comments. We're saving your chat. Thank you so much. But please do come back after the break. 10 minutes. I'll turn the timer on right now, and then we'll begin counting down. Everyone, another call out to Andy, who suggested reading The 5 Dysfunctions of Team by Patrick Lencioni. That is a great book. Welcome back. Thank you for coming back with us. Lost my mouse connection there temporarily. Hate it when that happens, but my batteries must be getting low. They always pick a moment like this to go low. You know, it's never when I'm just doing ordinary things. So we're going to do a couple of case studies in our time together. The first one we'll read together, and then we'll ask you to comment in the chat window on these. So the board goes into firefighting mode is our title of this case. And the board meeting began as any other at Forest School with the, with the usual approval of minutes from the previous meeting and oral reports by the board chair and head of school. The head noted that the end of term was fast approaching and said that she anticipated a very happy conclusion to another successful school year. When the chair asked if there were any questions, one board member, a parent of two students in the middle school, said, "From what I'm hearing from my friends, the end of the school year will be anything but happy. Just about everyone I talk with is unhappy with the degree of teacher turnover for the coming year." Another parent chimed in, "I know a family in the lower school that's looking at other options because they hear such dreadful things about middle." Matters took an even darker tone when a third member of the board made a motion to begin an ad hoc committee to investigate and fix the middle school. The chair, sighing, said, "There's a motion on the floor. Do I hear a second?" After a board member seconded the motion, the chair said, "Any discussion?" A fierce and at times vicious debate then broke out between the head, desperate to reinsert herself in the story, and the three trustees who now seemed closely aligned with each other. So you got the picture, ordinary routine end of year board meeting, does her report, and then into the space afterward when questions entertained, a board member says, "I'm hearing this feedback in the community." And away we go into the rabbit hole. So that's our dynamics of the case study. So number of questions, you could react to any of them, but we'd really love to hear your thoughts in the chat window. But first, make sure you have the basics here of the study, and then how should things like this be handled? Who's in charge of customer satisfaction? Is this about anecdote or data? Let's go with those three questions to start with. Pose your responses in the chat window, and Abby and I will watch it. What do you think? Is this a board topic? I guess that's another.
So school management is not the work of the board, overstepping boundaries. Mm-hmm. This is clearly about anecdotes. Yeah, it is clearly, right? This is the one board member who said, it's like when your kids come home and said, nobody likes that teacher. I'm like, okay, nobody, right? So this is,
right.
What?
And I see Gil saying, and hi Gil, good to know you're with us again. That it's not data driven, and that's true. It's anecdote driven, really, right. Isn't it? It's the which is, we could argue what's a data stream, but I think those kinds of comments are often based on one off or even at most two off experiences. Hearsay.
Yeah.
Okay. Need survey. Yeah. Data. Margaret, right. This is an example of the board not understanding its role or choosing not to understand its role. Or Margaret, I'll go one further with you on that. Thank you for saying that. We meet a lot of board members that think this really is their role. Mm. That their job is to mind the line at the neighborhood coffee place and get the feedback and bring that into the boardroom. And that inevitably becomes problematic because it's not a systematic look at things in the school, is it?
Exactly. So in Jessica, to build on that point, Jessica, but board members often feel that they have a different finger on the pulse and need to enlighten the head, and would sometimes think the data isn't right and the lived experience of parents is just as important. Yeah, lived experience of parents is important, but as Mark said, there have to be systematic ways to collect those experiences and collect that data. And one board member is just saying, from what I hear, it's not systematic and not, really not, in that respect, not reliable.
Someone's saying chair should have, Michael's saying chair should have challenge the whole thing regarding setting up a committee.
Right.
Should have put that in the lap of the head of school.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Andy, again, I would suggest that a good strategy for some of these things is prevention, right? Provide information on turnover and recruitment, right? Yeah. So yes, because when somebody says that, if you have the data that says, well, no, that's not accurate, right? The data is clearly showing the opposite, could short circuit that.
Steve, trigger comment was about staff turnover, data that may be irrelevant. Steve, you're spot on there in the term trigger comment. I know that word trigger is somewhat loaded in at least in the West in the current moment around political correctness, but it is important. That word this is like catnip for board members, right? They dive into this with a vengeance around around things like staff turnover, and we've encountered situations where the staff that were turning over were staff that the head of school was kind of happy to see turnover. But remember that that no matter how bad, the worst teacher in your school is somebody's favorite teacher, and you find out exactly when something like this goes down. I want to comment something about that question. How should the other board members engage? That's on the list, Abby. I think the obligation for good governance inures to every board member, not just the chair.
Yeah.
And I think this is the point where any board member at the table should feel open to say, wait a minute, is this our problem? Is this something that belongs in the boardroom? Before we go create a board level task force, before we launch down this discussion, let's just have a conversation about this. Is this a board level issue? And I think that's something that any one of us as board members could do.
That's one of the things, Mark, you bring up an excellent point. I think that we really need to support, schools, and boards need to support one another. You have a mutual accountability to one another, okay? You really are required to hold one another accountable to the norms and the standards and the wise practice that you have determined is going to govern the way you do your business. And I think in a lot of schools that sometimes board members are reluctant to do that. Reluctant to, because they're social connections and they live in the community together, and they are sometimes reluctant to say, hey, you know what, this is not right. This is not
the kids play together, right?
Right. So this is not right, and we understand that it's difficult. That does not, however, negate the or obviate the need to do that. Okay, you must hold one another accountable, and it can't always just fall to the chair, right? It has to be a mutual operation.
Andy mentioned Pat Lencioni and his 5 dysfunctions of teams back before in that book, which is a really good book, by the way. If you haven't read it, it's amazing, and it's amazingly applicable to board dynamics. We could do a whole discourse on that, but there's a quote. It's buried in there, and it's really important that people don't pay attention to, and it says that a team is a small number. I could actually pull it up here and get this quote perfectly right, but I'll go for a paraphrase if you'll permit it. A board is a small number of people committed to a common purpose for which they hold each other mutually accountable. And that's the mutual accountability piece that you're bringing in there. Any one of us can say, is this really ours?
Exactly.
And then you can begin that conversation. Jolene's saying perhaps the board doesn't understand the complaint procedure. Again, I'll go back to it and back to Margaret's point. There are board members that really see themselves as being the complaint bureau. And I think that ups the ante on norming what our board does get into and what our board doesn't get into. Because every year when you onboard new board members, people come with different sensibilities about that, maybe based upon their country of origin or their previous school that they were in, but norming how we handle that here is what's really important.
And that goes back to, right, doing the vetting ahead of time, right? And making sure people understand this is how our board does its business. Okay, this is what we do. This is what we do not do. These are our norms, and we expect everyone to abide by them. Andy, you pointed out something really, really important there. I think the scenario points out one of the most crucial issues in the board-head relationship. Does the board trust the head to deal with school issues, right? So yeah, I think that's an incredibly valid point. Because if that trust is there and the board does trust the head, then the conversation likely doesn't happen, or it gets short-circuited quite quickly.
Well, oh my goodness, that opens up a huge topic
Yes.
about the role of trust.
Trust.
So if I could, and I, again, this could be its own session, and just permit the digression. Trust is so fundamental to how schools work. It's fundamental to what happens, and this is something I've thought for decades now. I realized this maybe in my son's year in junior kindergarten, that when I drove up in front of the school, parked, got out and walked him into the school, that there was fundamentally a trust transaction going on. I was handing over my child to a group of educators, trusting that they would not just take care of him and keep him safe, but do what was in his developmental interest for stuff that would happen in 20 years, 25 years, today, as a matter of fact. And the importance, the currency of trust in schools, I think, cannot be overstated, and its importance. If there are board members, to Abby's point, if there are board members that don't trust the head of school or management team, then that alone should become the topic of conversation in the boardroom. Because absent the level of trust, not much of the rest of what we're going to say matters, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also it becomes a vicious circle or cycle. I never get that right. But it really takes on a life of its own, that when the trust is damaged, it continues to perpetuate itself, because the trust is damaged, and then the director or the head of school is feeling defensive, and perhaps starts to avoid and really kind of rethinking how they react, and then the board becomes more distrustful, and it just keeps feeding on itself, right? It just becomes a never-ending kind of bad spiral down. So that really is it's so critically important. Rami, I've said something that is also so spot on. So, this is also a reminder of the importance of a culture of inquiry among the board members, instead of a culture of judgment. Okay. So what we said before about, continue to learn, whenever you're having discussions, you want to seek understanding. You want to seek context. You're not seeking to cast blame, or to be accusatory, right? So keep that in mind, that culture of inquiry.
Yes. So that does beg the question, doesn't it? Is there ever a moment when the board should assume a firefighting posture? I mean, absent the real fire, okay? But is there ever really a moment where metaphorically, firefighting is important? So, if the barbarians really are at the gate, I mean, if you have this scene in front of your school, that's a bad date, by the way. That's a bad date. However, we really have seen something not much different at a school once. But if you got that, yeah, that's an all hands on deck kind of board engages kind of moment, because at risk here is the whole enterprise. Moral, legal, and ethical misconduct. It happens in a school. We're human institutions, and into human institutions walk, well, humans with all the frailties thereof. And occasionally it's necessary that a senior administrator, a revered teacher, even a head of school has to be disappeared in the middle of the night because of some conflict, some transgression that they've committed. But that's a moment when boards need to be on point in the community and of the same message. Again, the premature abrupt departure of the head for whatever reason. And lastly, we're taking predictably incendiary action. There are a handful of things which just are almost guaranteed to ignite a school community. And Abby, I'm sure you saw these in your days at HKIS. I've certainly seen them at Wildwood. I've seen them in schools all over the world. And there's really a small bucket of those, but they're the kind of things where board members need to be a little more active and a little more on point.
Okay, so how do you stay out of trouble, right? So you know, a couple of things that we want you to be thinking about.
I have those. Wait a minute, Abby. I'm sorry. My apologies. Forgive me. I'm out of order. I have one slide out of order. May I jump to those predictably incendiary moments?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Absolutely. That's okay. That's okay. So predictably incendiary moments. Obviously, you would like to try to avoid them if you can. Okay, so that's our first tip for you. Try to avoid those. But there are some times that you can't, that things are going to happen. You have to be really thoughtful about the way that you control the narrative, you control the communication, you make sure that the information is getting out there effectively and appropriately, and that the board is in lockstep with the school administration and school leadership, and everybody is saying the same thing. So what are some of these moments? Okay, anything bad news about money? Yeah, that's bad. Okay. People are going to get, they're going to get up in arms and upset about that. Okay. So bad news about money, like you have to put through a large tuition increase or something like that. Bad news about academics. Okay. IB scores are not what they want it to be. SAT scores are not what you want them to be. So bad news about academics. Obviously, moral, illegal, and unethical misconduct. Okay, that you really have to obviously be on top of that. Have your legal counsel with you, and you have to be very clear and very careful about the communication. And again, you have to identify who is going to be speaking for the school, what they're going to be saying, and that everybody's on the same page. Okay, premature, abrupt departure of the head. Okay, that's never good. Okay, when the head goes home on Friday and doesn't come back on Monday, that's a problem. Okay, you're going to have to be ready to deal with that. Any kind of radical change to the school schedule. I remember years and years ago, I guess we were new to Hong Kong. I don't even think I wasn't on the board at that point. And they made a change in the Easter vacation schedule for that year. And it was a conflagration like I don't think anybody ever expected. And it took the rest of the school year to settle everything down. So, be aware of that. Any kind of cherished tradition, a World's Fair, a book fair, whatever your galas are, or your gatherings, or things that people look forward to year on year on year. Renaming those.
The Chinese New Year celebration.
Yes.
Of this.
Changing those, not a good idea, right? I mean, it's not a good idea. If for some reason you have to do something like that, you better make sure you get buy-in from community leaders and other people who can help you move this thing through. And changing the grading scheme, right? That's a big one that's going to bring, I think, some significant headaches. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit like changing faculty compensation. Even if you're making the grading scheme better and more fair, no one's going to believe that going in, because they're just primed to believe that somehow they're losing in this process. Mm-hmm. So what's true about all of these things on this list is that their emotional load. All of them are very emotionally laden issues. And we know that it's emotion that drives most of the epic conflicts in the world. Right. So that's what makes these so important.
Right. And okay. And yes, obviously we started off by saying, try to avoid these, but sometimes you can't, but be prepared, right? Understand how there has to be some kind of systematic process for how you're going to deal with these issues. So making sure that you have a communication plan in place, making sure that you know what to do if there is a crisis of a moral or a legal, issue. You have a crisis team in place, who's going to be talking, who you have to contact. So make sure you're as prepared as you possibly can be be if you have to deal with these situations. Because Mark is right, they're emotionally laden and emotion drives action for people.
Keeping your board out of trouble. Sorry, we were here a moment ago, but then I was out of order. So there you go, Abby.
Okay, so all right, so how do you stay out of trouble? Okay, so just a couple, in addition to the things that we've been talking about, some other things to think about. Conduct your business openly in front of the head of school, with the head of school, with the director there. So what Mark and I mean by that is no sidebars, no secret discussions, no going into executive session after every single meeting because you want to talk about something that you feel you can't talk about in front of the head. If you feel that you have to do that, that's an indication that there's an issue with the relationship. Okay. I don't know, Mark may have his own thoughts on this, but in my mind, the only time that the board should be meeting or going into an executive session without the head is when they're talking about the head's evaluation
or contract.
Other than that, I'm at a loss to think about when the head wouldn't be there.
Thank you for bringing that up, because the importance of this cannot be overstated. I really believe the relationship between boards and heads of school is one of partnership. And if you're partners, you don't make decisions by yourself.
Right.
These big decisions, you get in the room and you talk about them. So in the spirit of partnership, you include the head in all of the conversations of the board.
Right.
Every now and then I hear a board member say, well, we need time to meet by ourselves so we can talk about the head.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That suggests a lack of trust,
that's a
lack of confidence. And then that really needs to become the conversation rather than whatever else would be.
So, Mark, when you're talking about decision making, last week did you show the who decides the graphic?
Yes, I did.
Right. Okay. Yes. So that's a beautiful illustration that there are board decisions, there are head decisions, but all of those decisions are informed by the other party. Right. Nothing is ever done in a vacuum. So the business is done collaboratively with the director, head of school in the room. Okay, avoid conflicts of interest, okay? Or avoid them if they arise. Please make sure that you let your fellow board members know so the decision can be made on how to proceed, okay?
I mean, though, before you leave that, I want to say something about there's a dual nature to conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And I think we get one really good or really well, and the other one we don't get so well.
Okay.
Mostly, occasional exceptions, we're good at avoiding conflicts of interest about financial dealing with the school, or of not having our business privately do business. Get that? We're pretty good at that. Occasionally a feeling, but generally speaking, I think we're really good at that. Where we're not so good is at recognizing the emotional conflicts of interest that come from having a kid in the school, an alum kid, any other, that we have this emotional connection to the institution. That means that we aren't really independently, and that's okay. We just need to be aware.
You have to recognize it, right? So that's one of those, Mark, that's one of those inherent conflicts, right, of being on an international school board, right? Because you're governing, as a member of the community. Exactly. And you have to be, that's life. That is the reality. But be aware of that. Be aware of the pitfalls of that. Okay. Next, governed by data, not anecdote. We spoke about that. This next one, set aside special interests. That goes, I think, directly back to the conflict of interest, right? So there's an independent mindedness that is demanded of board members, and you must keep in mind that when you are making decisions. The interests of the school. And when I say school, Mark may have a different perspective on this, but when I say school, I'm thinking about the entity, and Mark, was it Pat Bassett who said that, it's decisions, it's the school, the students, and then everything else. Was that Pat?
That's right. That's right. That's Pat.
So that's what I'm getting at here, right? So you have a responsibility to the future, right? You have a responsibility to intergenerational equity and making sure that this institution is sustainable for the next, however old you are, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. So you have to make sure that the interests of the school supersede everything else. So that's letting go of, okay, my kid is in this class and I have to think about that. No, you can't. You must think about the school. And last but not least, respect confidences. Okay, that's part and parcel with trust. Okay, board members have to feel comfortable and confident that the conversations they have in that board meeting are going to stay in the board meeting. Okay, that to not have that, leads to diminished ability to have conversation and to make decisions, and really can run into some real reputational risks if confidences are violated and things get out of hand. So that's a core pillar for us, respecting confidences, that just can never be violated.
Which is a great tee up to a next case study, which we'll roll into. And really, we've got the fun stuff ahead of us here. A great case study, and then looking at some very new stuff that we want to bring you tonight. So start with the case.
Okay, so I'm going to read this one. This is how to sell really bad news. Okay, the situation at the International School of Lumara was dire. After several years of declining enrollment due to several rounds of currency devaluation in the country, causing multiple waves of corporate interest to leave, a seeming steady floor of around 650 students remained from a mix of a few NGOs and many self-paying local families. The board and the administration had expected the situation to stabilize with each devaluation round, so the school's fixed cost dropped much more slowly than enrollment, as more teachers were retained on contract than ended up being needed. In short, the school burned through its meager reserves and line of credit, such that a 22% tuition increase was now needed over a 2-year period in order to avert insolvency. Okay, yeah, bad news, right? Really bad news. The board approved the increase at its February meeting. After all, what else could it do? The chair and the head agreed to co-sign a letter to be emailed to parents in March, advising them that their tuition would be 14% higher for the coming year. Okay, Mark, I just lost the slide.
I got it, but I also lost my mouse. So give me a second and it will connect again.
Okay.
I am waiting till it reconnects.
Okay, I can keep reading.
It's back.
Okay.
We're back.
Okay, all right, we're good. Okay, agreed to co-sign a letter to be emailed to parents in March, advising them that their tuition would be 14% higher for the coming year, and then another 8% higher the following year. However, word of the increase leaked from the board and into the community within a few hours. By the next morning, several parents' WhatsApp nodes exploded with messages ping-ponging back and forth between angry parents. By the end of the day, a flash mob of around 200 parents had massed in front of the school demanding to meet with the board. So that picture that we showed you before, barbarians at the gate, that's what's going on at this place right now. Okay, so you got the gist, right? So really didn't react to an ongoing situation in the country. Enrollment was dropping, fixed costs were not, or they were dropping much slower, resulting in the fact that if this tuition increase is not put through, the school's probably not going to be in business, in a couple of years. So this is really bad news, super bad news. So let's look at these. Let's look at some of these questions, and what's the board's obligation to prepare for worst case kinds of events? And when you have bad news of this sort, how should it be handled? Okay, and let's talk about the confidentiality, right? How important is confidentiality in the work of the board? So let's see what. Okay. Okay,
I like Tom.
Tom Potter said time to resign from the board and fly home. No, not an option, Tom. Sorry, can't do that one.
Sorry. I have to say, this is an actual, none of these numbers are made up. This is a very real case study that went down at a school. Should have done an annual risk evaluation. Exactly. And I would say this was a place where this kind of thing was, let's just say, assumptions of stability were wildly optimistic.
Yes. So this is a case where, this is when people, like, this is very trite, but, Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Okay, so that was not going on there, obviously. So, sorry, Andy, you and I share a brain. Okay. Predict the worst case response and have a rationale to explain it. No, you got it.
Communicate the issues to parents. Yes, they didn't get here overnight. This was something that had been developing. So there is an issue of communication, but it also illustrates, I think, how sometimes good intentions end up causing unfortunate follow-on effects. And the idea of let's not increase tuition very much one year can have knock-on effects in another year that cause much higher increases than one would like to explain. Which means something interesting, Abby. I hadn't really thought about this in this case before, that there's a thing called intergenerational equity on boards, that you as a board member owe the next board, the next group of people sitting at the table, something, and not sending them a mess that they'll have to clean up if you can avoid it.
Yeah.
And tuition increases often happen as a result of that.
I mean, really, the financial stability and sustainability of the school is one of your main obligations, primary obligations as members of the board. So this board clearly was derelict in not doing the scenario planning and not being better prepared for this.
Natalie is saying leaking is a recipe. Absolutely. This, if nothing else, this illustrates the absolute importance of confidentiality around deliberations. And if you don't have that, back to the notion of trust. And if you know Pat Lencioni's work on dysfunctions of teams, pretty much everything Pat talks about is built on a foundation of trust. If you don't have that, then nothing else much matters. So that really is pivotal here.
Okay.
Wow. Right. Yes. Yeah. Good comments flung by.
Loose lip. Yeah. Yes, Catherine, they do. Loose lips do sink ships. That is absolutely correct.
Tom's point here, the board didn't oversee finances well enough. Strategic planning is essential. To what degree, and this, I think COVID really is a great case study of this. To what degree do we include Nicholas Taleb's famous black swan idea in our strategic planning? These wildly unpredictable, seemingly wildly unpredictable events. And I think they're increasing. In our country here in the United States, we're having 100-year floods every 5 years. We're having 50-year fires every 6 months. So how do we begin to reset our, and this is a great board topic, how do we reset our risk calculus when we're planning for scenarios for the future?
Right. And that scenario planning, that's an active exercise that boards need to do, right? I mean, that should be part of your regular practice, that you sit down and you say, okay, what's worst case here, right? And how are we going to deal with it? Okay, so Daniel says we had to announce a double-digit increase. Where I lost it. Okay, we had to announce a double-digit increase recently. We started with data before the announcement at our AGM. We showed lack of increase in previous years, specific increases in costs, and other factors to justify the necessity. We also pointed to our mission and values. Our first value is trust. So how did it go, Daniel? I mean, what was the real-time response to that? All good. Okay. Good.
Well, great comments again in chat. So we'd really encourage you to spend some time reading through the chat window. This is an incredibly great group.
Yeah, really.
And we thank you so much for putting these chats in here. Charles says a basic fiduciary duty to prepare for the worst case handled by clear communication. That's a really interesting point, Charles. I wonder how many boards think about preparing for the worst case? And I'm not sure many do.
No.
Until we're in it.
Until you're in it.
Prepare for it.
But you see, and that's a lesson. Okay, that right there, Mark, that's a lesson that COVID should have taught us, right? That, okay, you need to start preparing for this stuff. None of us could have ever anticipated what has gone on for the last 20 months. No, I don't. Well, I shouldn't say no one. I'm sure Dr. Fauci did or something. But anyway, most of us could not have done that. But it really shows us, okay, you know what? We better start getting ready for the next one. We better start doing the scenario planning, because if we think that something else isn't going to come down the pike, we're kidding ourselves. You must do the scenario planning.
And we may not know exactly what the black swan is, but there's a black swan out there. It's coming, and it may not be another pandemic, but it may be something else. And the general drift we're getting, and I'm happy to share with you. I'm going to look for it here soon. But I saw some data earlier this afternoon that suggests that the rate of what we would think of black swan events in the world is actually accelerating in the last 50 years by a factor of 5. So that's important to know, that the stuff that we used to think was, oh, that'll never happen, it's happening. And it's happening with a frequency that means we have to factor that into the scenarios that we think about.
Okay.
Oops, I'm in the wrong place. So let's turn our attention at the moment to adapting to the long tail of COVID, and what do we mean by success? And we're going to come up with a new word for it. Not a new word you know, but it's a new word that we haven't heard talked a bit in schools, and that's the idea of organizational resiliency. So we're going to get to resiliency in a number of ways. There's a quote, and this is I thought particularly meaningful, so I'm going to bring it up. Stephanie Ducek, who's at a university in Dresden in Germany in the EU, says critical events, even if they are predictable, often come as a surprise because organizations take refuge in denial. This means that for many organizations, the future is less unknowable than it is unthinkable. Mm-hmm. And that's an incredibly interesting comment, because it means that the future we're preparing for might be our own extinction, which is a particularly unthinkable topic. But it's, what are the threats that could portend that? How would we know it if we saw it? This is really speaks to the heart of resiliency in our institutions. And we're going to talk a bit about resiliency in a moment, because we think there's been a bit of a focus on robustness in organizations and schools. And this picture, we think, illustrates robustness well. It's a tree. Obviously, the wind has a prevailing direction it's blowing, and the tree has stayed up and growing in the direction of the prevailing wind. That's robust. It stayed a tree. It stayed up. It's doing what it does. But here's the problem with robustness. Robustness has a shelf life. At some point, this happens to that tree. It just goes, right? It stops being able to tolerate the wind, and it flops over, crushing the truck in the way. Fortunately, not the house in this picture, but that happens. So robustness, and here's the takeaway, and really important point for you. Robustness works for a short time. It's good at getting through stressors that are very limited in time, and then we bounce back and keep growing in the same direction. An alternative, Ducek's alternative here, is that of being a resilient tree. And we love this picture. Abby found this because it illustrates so beautifully resiliency. It's a tree that just gave up. It laid over and started growing on the ground, and it's still a perfectly functional, viable tree.
So this is the resilient tree adapted, right? So
yes.
sorry, right?
That's actually it. That's the whole notion, really, isn't it? Is about adaptation, which when I encountered this concept of resiliency and adaptation, it brought me back to my early days as a psychologist and the work of Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist. That's a drawing of Piaget that framed really how children learn, how humans learn. And Piaget, for those of you who aren't a child development wonk, said that children learn through a cyclical process of assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is where we take in the idea. Intellectually, maybe a child knows it. But accommodation is where we've changed something about how we operate on the world in order to accommodate that idea. We brought that idea inside. We've made it part of us. So many things go through that notion of assimilation, accommodation. So at first we have to assimilate, and then we can accommodate. And it's in the accommodation that growth occurs. We're going to argue today with you that organizations and schools learn the same way that humans learn, through a process of assimilation and accommodation, and that we have a choice. We can choose robustness, which would make really good sense if we were talking in June 2020, or in September 2021. This has gone on long enough that resilience makes a lot more sense as the accommodation we make to this. It's not get through it and go back to being what we were. We believe that all of the stuff in that earlier slide, COVID, demographic change, geopolitics, climate change, really argues for a fundamental accommodation to a new reality in our schools, something new, not just for how we operate schools, but also for our students as well. So flashback, a year ago, we did a session just like this.
Right.
It was probably within this week to exactly a year ago.
It was exactly, I think it was exactly a year ago that we did this. And what did we say about the new normal? And I still don't like the word normal, but that's my own hang up.
Well, we said it then, and this was actually the graphic that we used, Abby. So we just pulled this and brought it forward.
No, but that just a quick aside. For me, it's about the reality, right? It's the new reality, because I mean, if normal was what it was in 2019, we're never going to go back to normal. We're just going to go to a new reality that's going to force us to adapt and evolve and be resilient. So anyway, this is what we said when we were talking to you last year. We said that digital skills are going to be a core competency for students and teachers alike. And yes, we continue to see that now. Digital is not going away. There's going to be different models of learning, different models of delivering educational programming, and that requires different competencies and skill sets, not only for students, but for teachers, right? To be able to effectively to teach in this new reality of where we are in September 2021. Agility is the new growth. And these agility is the new growth, and the future may well look smaller. I think those are quite connected. Agility is, we have to be agile. We have to be able to adapt. We have to constantly recalibrate, look at what's going on in the environments, look at our priorities. Do they need to be reprioritized? Do we need to reallocate resources? So it requires a finesse and agility to make sure that we're managing that. The future may well look smaller, okay? I think for many years, we've all equated size with strength, right? And
especially in this region, yes.
Right. If the enrollment's there and we have the numbers and we have, we keep adding students, that's good. That means good. So size equals strength. We don't think that that's necessarily the case anymore. Sustainability and strength are not necessarily driven by size. They have to be driven by what is best to achieve the mission and vision of the school, and best use of resources to deliver the programming to the students. So the future may look smaller. Okay, schools may need to right size. And look at their cost structures and their teaching staff, and that doesn't mean that a school is weaker. It just means that it's more, it's stronger, and that may be smaller.
Abby,
Bravery.
I'm gonna forgive me a second on that
That's
point.
okay.
I'd like to jump in. I'd like to channel my friend Rob Evans, who some of you probably know, who's like me, a psychologist, who's done a number of, with Michael Thompson, a number of groups, I think, with heads of school and board members in your region. Rob likes to talk a lot about differences between schools and businesses, corporations, for-profit entities. And I think this is one of those important points that in the corporate world, growth is an imperative. It's as much an imperative as the publish or die imperative in academia, in higher education for faculty. But in schools, in nonprofits, it need not be, because we may at times grow, we may at other times shrink, we may at times look different than we do now. We may be virtual, we may be remote, we may be in different places, but growth is not the imperative for us. It's that it is for other industries, and I think that's a critical difference.
It is, right, because the profit motive, right, is not there for our nonprofit schools, and it's about sustainability and how can you best deploy the assets and resources of the school to be sustainable. Bravery is an essential leadership attribute. Okay, this is not a time for the faint of heart. Okay, we've talked continually throughout this presentation about the issues with which schools are dealing. So it really requires, brave leadership, working together with your team, gathering the information that you need, gathering the data that you need, making decisions and communicating those decisions accurately and efficiently. And the last thing that we said, and we continue to believe this, those who act earlier, faster, and more decisively do best. I think history has shown us, and I know that Mark and Judy have, I think, probably years of research on this, is when crises happen, the schools that kind of just say, okay, we're going to hunker down and we're just going to try to wait this out, typically don't emerge in a strong position as schools that are strategic and continue to apply and look at things from a strategic viewpoint and saying, okay, what decisions do we have to make? What reprioritization do we have to do? How do we have to reallocate things? So yes, understanding that there are tactical things that need to be dealt with in situations when it's a crisis, but you cannot ever let go of that strategic lens, right? It has to be there as well, because you have to continue, you have to continue moving forward. One of our clients that Mark and I were working with over the past year or so, one of the board members likened it to sailing, right? So you have to know where you're going, right? You can't ever lose sight of where you want to go long term. What you may do is you're going to tack differently, you're going to have a different course, but you have to keep your eye on that strategic horizon. Mark, was it Pat Lencioni who said that every school is going to be changed because of this? Yeah. So we were sitting on with the table group, and Pat said every school is going to be changed. Everyone. Some of them will emerge stronger and with more sustainability, and some will not. And it really depends on the actions they take throughout and during the crisis.
So that was a year ago, and it still seems very, very fresh, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So very new data. Some of you know the McKinsey Consulting Group, which is global and does a number of things. McKinsey now has an entire practice focused on what children need for their futures. And one of their first projects is identifying new career paths for students. So to illustrate our point that this is not just about the schools and adults, but this has implications for students, we would go to the next slide, this one. And these are 6 occupations, careers, that McKinsey says would be growth opportunities for students of tomorrow. Game designer, not just in creating the next game that people obsessively play on their smartphone, but game designer in terms of creating instructional software that is used to gamify everything from medical instruction to business school to graduate disciplines. Digital tailor, someone who's able to take digital images and convert them into garments and clothing for people who aren't going in and out of stores. Garbage designer is someone who can take the refuse of the world, which is growing exponentially, and turn it into something useful for the future, useful products or useful recyclables. Drone traffic controller. Once our friends at Amazon get started delivering their packages by drone around the world, someone's got to sort out the drone traffic, don't they? Precision pharmacist, not just filling prescriptions, but creating very specific pharmaceutical vectors that target diseases at the molecular level. And digital currency advisor. Most of us in my generation, I'm an old geezer, probably think about Bitcoin as something that's a bit beyond, not what we got to worry about. But our kids are going to live in a Bitcoin world. They're going to live in a digital currency world. What's that going to be about? How do we advise people about how to approach an investment? Someone today who's 30, how would you advise them to approach their investment portfolio with or without digital currency? It's an interesting question. And it's one about which I'm going to argue that people of my generation may have limited expertise at being able to advise. So we could go on and on, but these are just 6 that McKinsey sees being. So here's the message for you. We've spent a lot of time this evening talking about this morning, your time, talking about the challenges that the current moment faces. But watershed moments like this create opportunities that our kids are going to be living out. And our job as governors and leaders of schools is to ensure that our schools are preparing students to go forth and live in worlds which are really alien to the worlds that we have known.
Right.
And the kind of world we experience.
So Mark, this is really about some of the very pithy and meaty conversations that boards and heads have. It's really about preparing children for life, right? That should be, conversation one, right? How do we prepare kids for life? And that preparation is going to look dramatically different than it looked like when we were all in school. So that's a key conversation that you all should be having.
And that's really it, isn't it? It's about how do you and your head of school partner, and we really can't underscore that word partner enough, to build the future together. What's that future going to look like for our school? How is it going to serve the interests of our students? And how does it serve the interest of the country that we're in,
right,
given the changes in demography and purpose, perhaps, that our schools have seen in recent years? That dialogue requires a phenomenal amount of trust between our governance piece on the one hand and our management piece on the other. But we love this illustration because we think it really does fit together like puzzle pieces. Yes. One just interlocks into the other. Yeah. And that conversation is really what we think this year and next will be about for your, forgive me, hit the wrong button several times.
So one of the things, just to add on to that, and one of the things that we try to focus on and really hammer home with the boards with whom we work and leadership is the fact that your success, you're mutually dependent on one another for the success, your success as board members, your success as leaders of school, and the success of the school, right? Your destiny and your success, you're inextricably connected and entwined. And you need to have that partnership. It has to be a productive, collaborative partnership where you are focusing on the right stuff, right? And the right stuff is, making sure the strategy is there, making sure you're having those conversations about preparing kids for life, making sure that you're taking care of leadership and succession planning, and that you're taking care of the finances. But this is a collaborative effort, right? It doesn't happen like this. It happens like this.
So we really think there's two questions that you collectively as leaders, administrators, and board members at school need to be taking up. And in some ways, I think this is the most important slide coming up that we've shown you, because this is the tee up to this year. A year ago, we suggested things for boards to talk about. This year, we have two things for you to talk about, and we believe they're really only two. The first is, what does resilience look like for our students, and how do we become better at inculcating this attribute? If nothing else, our children are going to need incredible levels of resilience to be able to adapt and thrive in whatever comes at them in the unknowable future. And maybe that's always been true, but I think the dial just got turned up a lot by what's happened in the past couple of years.
It's been ratcheted up, I think significantly. And then following on to that, the second question we want you to be asking is, what would resilience look like for our school? And how do we become a more resilient organization? If you are expecting your students to be resilient and you want to inculcate that attribute in their educational experience, you as an organization have to be resilient. So what is that going to look like for your school? How are you going to define that? What is success going to look like? What does strength look like? And how do you build in the resilience and the framework to get yourselves there? So only two questions, but they're two pretty meaty questions that you all really need to spend significant time thinking about.
And the subtext to them both, Abby, is not just how do we survive unscathed or as scathed as little as possible. It's really about, how do we change? How do we adapt? How do we become something new as a result of what we're going through?
Something new and hopefully stronger, right? There's opportunities in crisis. So yes, surviving is great. Okay. And you want to survive with as few bruises as possible, but you would hope that with the lessons that you've learned, that you emerge on the other side in a stronger position and in a more sustainable position. And yes, Nadine, I agree. In Nadine's opinion, we can't have resilience without belonging. That's where I'd focus. I agree.
I think that's its own topic around the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And for me, that word belonging is the real word there, because our schools, and I'll leave you with this thought, are really our schools are anchors for the people, the families that come to them, and feeling a sense of belonging, a place where students feel known and cared for, is absolutely critical. Yet all the things that we have talked about earlier, 2 hours ago, are things which place that sense of belonging under tension.
Right.
So maybe when you think about your answer to the question of what does resilience look like for our school and for students, it's how do we feel more, how do we feel belonging in a place where there's ever more divisive forces?
Yes, and how do you?
Andy, thanks, Andy. We'll look at Angela's work.
Yes,
I've heard of her, but thank you.
How do you inculcate that belonging? Again, going back to some of our earlier slides, when the communities are so different, are so heterogeneous, and you have different value systems and different expectations. That's tough work. Tough work.
Well.
Okay.
Thank you for hanging with us. Very, very, very interesting conversation. Great dialogue in the chat. Hope you've been paying attention to that. I've saved the chat. It's really great stuff in there. We do have more coming. Up next is our board chair roundtable on 2 October. And please, you register for that through EARCOS if you wish. It will be a separate login. It will not be the same kind of login information. We've had a number of questions from people asking, if I'm not a board chair, can I still attend? The answer is yes. If you're not a board chair, you might be one day, right?
Okay.
So,
Fair enough.
Abby was a board member before she became a board chair. So please do come back if you wish to our board chair
Right.
roundtable in October. And thank you all so very much on behalf of EARCOS and Ed Green, who again extends his apologies for not being able to be here because of his power failure at his house. We thank you so much for being part of the international school community.
Yeah, and thank you for spending the time with us on a Saturday morning. We appreciate it. Yes, we will get you the slides, and yes, we will get Mark. We can get the recording out as well, right?
I'm going to send it over to EARCOS tomorrow, and they'll get it out to folks.
Okay, so then you can see the chat as well. So we hope to see many of you on October 2nd. And until then, everybody be well and be safe. And thank you all.
Thank you.